Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here at the MOBIUS conference, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about failure. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I just need to stand in front of the microphone. That was the signal. Okay. Never in my life been accused of being too quiet. Maybe somebody could close the door. Thank you. So, failure. We've all been there, right? But there are probably as many different definitions of failure as there are people in this room. For most people, failure is defined as a lack of success. But I want to unpack that a little bit today and talk about our reactions to failure and how we can adjust those to use failure to its best advantage. In the book, The Soft Edge, Rich Karlgaard talks about a cause and relationship effect between failure and mistakes. Mistake can be embarrassing, but failure is connected to stronger emotions like fear and shame. The fear of failure can be something that drives us to work hard, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can also drive us to overplan, take the safe road, the road of low risk, and can get in the way of improvements, innovation, and really being excellent at what we do. Fear kills curiosity, quells exploration, dulls creativity, stunts growth, and saps performance, synergy, teamwork, and morale. Karlgaard writes that the mistakes and the failures they cause are opportunities for real learning, the kind that makes you smarter and more courageous. And interestingly, in this book, he addresses failure in a chapter called Smarts. My goal today is to reframe failure, to decouple it from emotion so that fear of shame and embarrassment is no longer an obstacle to great service. What I want to do today is to explore failure and our relationship to it in the hopes of adjusting our relationship so that we can use failure more productively. So how does failure hold us back? In early May, there was a post on ALA Think Tank, which is a Facebook group of about 1,000 members. Some of you are probably on it. And the question was, occasionally this group has more philosophical questions, some practical questions, but philosophical questions as well. The question was, what would you do if you knew you could not fail? And I promise I didn't pay anybody to post this question. It was just a lucky coincidence for me and this topic. There were 94 responses in 8 hours. And I took a close look at them. There's no way we can know what people meant or the context of their response, but I did my best to kind of group them into categories. And they did fall into 3 pretty specific categories. 27 responses were jokes or fantasies. Things like math, become supreme overlord. There are a lot of librarians who wish to be supreme overlord. Win the lottery. Of the fantasies, this was really the most popular. Lots of the responses had to do with winning the lottery or being able to fly, or my personal favorite, time travel. Some of them, I couldn't tell if they were jokes or fantasies, or maybe serious. In any event, these 27 responses didn't really indicate fear holding somebody back. It wasn't the fear of failure standing between the person and the response. Usually what stood in the way of the individual and the achievement was probability, or maybe the laws of physics. 7 of the 94 were aspiration for the greater good. Things like end hunger or join Doctors Without Borders. Again, it wasn't fear of failure that was holding people back. It was something else: luck, resources, actually being a doctor. Majority of these responses, almost half, were dreams, goals, or projects. Things like opening a new business, writing a book, going back to school. This one was my favorite. These are 4 things, 4 worthy goals that are eminently doable, eminently possible. In fact, they're done every day. There were a couple of TV references, X-Files and Twilight Zone. I've not seen these episodes, but I'm guessing because of the shows they're from, they were probably cautionary tales of the be careful what you wish for variety. There were also a few words of wisdom. Somebody said, "I'm not sure I'd like that. One of the fun things in work or life is the element of uncertainty and trying to beat the odds in the most uncertain circumstances." Another person responded, "I was given a paperweight with that saying. After looking at it day after day, I finally did it. A doctorate at the age of 54. Never give up on your dreams." Or this. So in preparation for this talk, that was my first bit of very unscientific research, and I did a little bit more unscientific research. I collected some anecdotes. I guess we could call it anecdotal evidence if we wanted to make this sound a little bit more important and highfalutin than it is. But I asked some people I know a few questions about their experience with failure. I created a Google form, and it had 4 questions on it. I asked people their primary pursuit, which is to say their profession, but I think sometimes people have a very strong avocation, which is to having a profession. And I specifically wanted to target librarians, of course, but also artists and scientists. And I thought that I'd get the artists more if I asked for their primary pursuit. I asked about a time when they or their organization failed and their reaction to it. I specifically asked for their reaction and not how they felt, because I wanted to get both emotional responses as well as actual things people did to move on with the failure. At least I was trying to do that. Didn't exactly turn out that way. And I asked people their opinion of the difference between a failure and a mistake. So here's what I learned. The first thing I learned is I'm really not friends with that many scientists. The second thing I learned was that people reported personal failures as opposed to organizational failures universally, even though I asked for either. I thought this was interesting. Perhaps personal failures resonate more. The third thing I learned was that people do respond emotionally to failure. And the artists were pretty sensitive about this. In fact, my query inspired a very lengthy Facebook post on somebody's page about what the difference was between a mistake and failure that thankfully one of my artist/librarian friends alerted me to. So how do people report responding to failure? They use some pretty strong words: disappointment, anger, depression, discomfort, regret, and pain, left out, and sad. This is my emphasis. To some extent, my reputation would be damaged, and this felt like bodily injury. Another said it felt uncomfortable and demoralizing. My former dean had a sign that said, "Only the mediocre are at their very best." I think this is totally true. You can stay in narrow variants of what you do. Good. And when things miss the mark, it's just kind of bad. But is it ever truly excellent? your work is mediocre. To be excellent means to sometimes miss the mark entirely. Sometimes what you do is groundbreaking, and other times it falls flat. So you work in a much wider variance. So how can people decouple failure from all those negative, unproductive emotions, shame, pain, disappointment, anger, and use it to learn, grow, and improve? That's what I'm going to be talking about today. So how did I get interested in this? Last April, I received an email from James Clear, who is a self-styled excellence guru. This is taken directly from his website. He's an entrepreneur, weightlifter, travel photographer in 20 plus countries. He's not my friend. I'm on his email list. He sometimes has interesting things to say about business philosophy. So I like to read what he says sometimes. So James sent around this email pushing his post about response to failure that really resonated with me. What he said was to treat failure like a scientist. He points out that to a scientist, failures are merely data points. They're not emotional occurrences. I thought about this a lot, and I wrote about it too. In my post, I wrote about decoupling failure from emotion, or at least decoupling failure from unproductive emotion, like shame and embarrassment, and embracing it as a learning experience. I thought about how I had experienced failure, not just my own, of which there are many, but how I've witnessed and worked with failure. And this next bit is a little bit emotional for me, so I'm just going to read it. Please bear with me. I spent most of my career at a large urban research library. Most organizations, we didn't always get things right. In 1999, I met Peter, my husband, the man I would marry 4 years later. Geographically inconvenient does not begin to describe him. He lived in London and I in New York City, but somehow we made this work. For me, a long-distance relationship worked quite well, mainly because I was in a demanding tenure-track job, and I could concentrate on work without feeling the demands of a relationship. And when appropriate, I could concentrate on a relationship without feeling the demands of work. I could compartmentalize, but I digress. I had a ticket to London for later in the week, so as was my habit, I woke up progressively earlier and earlier in order to minimize my jet lag. My jet lag preparedness plan. And by the way, that works. I did it for years. I would get to work early because by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was so tired, I was ready to go to bed. This Tuesday morning, I was at my desk by 7 and working away, oblivious to what was happening in the library, in the neighborhood, across the nation, or around the world. Little did I know that I would not be going home at 4 o'clock because 2 planes had struck the World Trade Center, just blocks from my office at the library. In addition to the obvious psychological stress and trauma of the day, we experienced logistical challenges too, like a second shift not being able to get to work. And despite this, my organization made the decision to remain open and fully staffed. Despite a federal emergency and an official closure of the neighborhood for nearly a week, we were still checking out books. There seemed to be an order to carry on, business as usual, when the day was anything but usual. Many of my colleagues disagreed with this decision. They felt vulnerable and hurt and wanted someone to make it all okay, clearly an impossible task. I learned from talking with psychologists after the fact that in emergencies, it's a very natural reaction for people, adults, to look to those in authority, almost as their parents, to just make everything okay. Being fascinated by organizational culture, I coped by keeping a healthy distance and studying what was going on. To the best of what I could see at all levels, the library was comprised of a bunch of people handling their own post-traumatic stress and trying to do what they felt was right as individuals in the wake of a catastrophe that we could never have envisioned on September 10th. Lots of people were unhappy. I would say they were more than unhappy, they were wounded. They felt their organization had let them down. So was it a failure or just an unpopular decision? I'm not convinced that staying open in the light of the catastrophic events of 9/11 was a failure on the part of the library administration. After all, it was a residential campus, and it was less than 2 weeks after some first-year students had arrived away from home for the very first time. They needed some type of adult presence. They needed some type of normalcy. They needed to read a novel or check out Dude, Where's My Car from the AV Center. And I'm not judging anybody. This is the movie that got me through 9/11. That and Sister Wendy reruns on PBS. Perhaps one could say that the organization failed the library staff who were expected to be this adult presence when they themselves were grieving. Sometimes, especially in emergencies, decisions are made in the moment and time tells you if they're right. If they aren't right, or if there are some aspects that aren't right, then the best thing to do is to determine how things might be better in future situations. And did we learn from it? You bet we did. So as I said, we were a large urban, let's see. There are a lot of constraints to keeping a library in New York City open, not the least of which is real estate prices. Library staff live in outer boroughs, and they largely don't have cars because New Yorkers don't have cars, and almost universally use public transit. So when public transit is disrupted, it's very difficult to keep the library open. So we thought about staffing when events make it difficult or impossible for people to get to work for the very first time. We developed a contingency plan for emergency staffing, which involved tiered service, depending on what we could legitimately provide and how many people could get to work. This was incredibly helpful in 2005 when a 2-day transit strike occurred during the finals period, and in the many snowstorms that have occurred in the past decade. So changing the expectation in what we could legitimately provide resulted in less stress for admins who now understood there were multiple ways to meet user need, and less stress for staff who didn't feel they were required to maintain business as usual in unusual situations. So a few years later, I was involved in a failure that was much more public. It was an ILS migration failure that some of you may remember because it was pretty public. This was more of a personal failure for me than what happened with staffing on 9/11 because I was directly involved in the selection and migration process. So what happened was we selected a system that was a very unusual choice for an ARL. Wasn't one of the usual suspects. And this was at a time when there were kind of 2 usual suspects, and it wasn't either one of those. But we were a bit of an entrepreneurial, different sort of place, so that was okay. And I was on the selection committee, and I had the ear of the dean, and so I told her that this is the direction that we're going, and I really pushed for this because it was a great system that would really meet our needs. There were 2 little pieces of programming that needed to happen, and the company was very willing to do this. So we worked on this migration. It was a very long timetable. We worked on it for a year, and then things went horribly wrong. We halted the purchase a month prior to implementation. So needless to say, disappointing doesn't even begin to describe what happens when you work on this huge project for a year and then all of a sudden it's not a project anymore. But I don't really remember any kind of witch hunt or blaming, which I think that's probably good because if there had been a scapegoat, it could have very easily been me. And certainly casting blame is to miss out on valuable opportunities to learn and improve. Looking back, it took us a really long time to accept the problems, and I think we felt that the sunk costs were too much to move on. Our planning kind of made us attached to an outcome, and we were sticking with it even though it became more and more apparent to us that it really wasn't the best for our organization. So in preparation for this talk, I spoke with my former deputy, Christina, who's one of the smartest, most effective library managers I know, and she also worked on this process. And the conclusion we came to was that the vendor had kind of overpromised, probably because we had overasked. We had grown increasingly dissatisfied with our outdated ILS, yet we had deferred the migration for far too long. The old ILS wasn't meeting our needs, and yet we were strangely wedded to the processes that it dictated. Many of them were local decisions. The system was, which as was common at that time, managed by one person. And nothing against this one person, but no one person can be expected to adequately understand the needs of every library department. We had an insufficient system for so long that we really couldn't conceive of anything radically different. We were sort of looking for an iterative change as opposed to a transformational one, when we really needed a transformational change. In many ways, our ILS migration failed, at least in part, because we were trying to replicate this antiquated system that didn't really meet our needs, which, looking back, seems crazy. So did we learn some lessons? Yes, we did. So after the migration failed, we signed with Olive and had a very rapid implementation that was managed by the vendor. Having the implementation managed by the vendor allowed us to move away from our enmeshment with local practices that weren't really meeting our needs. We also moved to a distributed style of managing the ILS, so there's now a team in place and not just one person who manages the system. Part of that is because ALF is a really complicated system and you can't really do it with one person. And we learned to really examine our structures and decisions and really think about them. And we learned that sometimes you have to sacrifice sacred cows even when it is difficult to do so. All right, so how do we learn and grow from failure? This is about, what we talk about now is what I wrote in my post about learning and growing from failure, and it's also been embellished by an article from that was in Inc. that talked about this topic as well. Okay, so the first step is to know that failure does happen. It's temporary. Projects, presentations, meetings, they can all be failures, but people aren't failures. If you're involved in a failure, it's not you. Explore your emotional relationship with failure so that you can begin to work more creatively and take more innovative risks. Forgive yourself. After all, you'd forgive a colleague, forgive someone else. The next step is to neutralize it. And this is really where you take the emotion out of it. It's not intentional. You didn't set out to create a service that didn't meet user needs or invest a year in an ILS migration that didn't happen. Think about this. Failure doesn't need to be infused with judgment. Think about the data points that simply contribute to learning. Sometimes it's helpful to think about your job as a lab. It helps you to be a little bit more risk tolerant. Remember that welcomed failure brings learning, whereas shamed failure just brings shame. Practice it. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "Do the thing you fear, and the death of fear is certain." If you take small risks, you can practice small failures. You can learn how to learn from failure in manageable ways. You learn you can survive, even thrive in the face of failure. Daily life doesn't always go right. If you poke at your failures in your daily life, you can learn to apply that knowledge in your professional life. Don't blame, but see what can be improved. Every failure, every mistake is a learning experience. And lastly, know that you're not alone. Think about the people whom you regard as successful. I guarantee you, they've all failed. In 2008, J.K. Rowling gave the commencement address at Harvard. She spoke about the benefits of failure and the importance of imagination, and I encourage you to watch this. It's obviously available on YouTube. She says that as a young person, she feared failure more than anything else in the world. And then in her 20s, she found herself a divorced single parent living in poverty. She says, "I was the biggest failure I knew." But that taught her a lot about herself. She faced her greatest fear and developed a tremendous self-awareness because of adversity. Her setbacks made her wiser and stronger. She says, "It is impossible to live without failing at something unless you have lived so cautiously that you might as well have never lived at all. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, the phonograph, and held 1,091 other patents. He also had a very healthy attitude toward failure. When you take great risks, it's only natural that you're going to fail. A lot. Edison developed a process for removing iron ore from stone. And part of the process involved crushing up the stone into sand. The sand was the byproduct. It was the waste in the process. When he opened the factory for extracting the iron ore, it failed. What did he do? He looked at the parts that were successful, and that sand crushing mechanism became the basis for a very successful cement works that was used to make cement for bridges, dams, roads, even the original Yankee Stadium, all over the country. And now when I walk down the street in New York, 100 years later, I like to look at the sidewalks and think that they're a very successful manifestation of Edison's original failure. Sometimes I wish I could go back in time. Actually, a lot I wish I could go back in time. I like to think about what it would be like to go to Edison's lab and how he dealt with his employees and how they dealt with failure. I bet they weren't afraid. So what happens in your organization when an error is discovered? Are people afraid? In a fear-based culture, people avoid risk. There's that narrow variance in performance that I talked about. There's no risk. There's no failure. There are no big successes either. Creativity Inc. is the only book I have in my small collection of management books with a chapter devoted to failure. It's a great book about the organizational culture at Pixar. One of the big takeaways is that playing it safe means there's no originality, no innovation, without taking risks. The best you can hope for is just kind of okay. So let's talk about the scientists. Chef David Chang is quoted in the book The Soft Edge as saying, "Western culture doesn't like to document failure, with the exception of the scientific community." Perhaps Pixar's comfort with learning from failure results from its roots as a hardware company, or maybe its founders' roots as scientists. So how can we take a more scientific approach to failure? Scientists hypothesize, test, analyze, conclude, and test again. It's an iterative process, and each idea leads to a better option. I often encourage people to treat their job like a lab, a place to experiment and innovate. This paradigm shift can help you to make peace with failure. In my personal experience, it also makes your job a whole lot more enjoyable. This is backed up by something I read in Creativity Inc. When experimentation is seen as necessary and productive, not a frustrating waste of time, people enjoy their work even when it's confounding them. So here's some of the responses that I got from the scientists when I did my, I can't even call it research, when I asked people to tell me about how they felt. This is a quote from a guy who failed the basic sciences in college. "I see it as a touch point in my life. I lacked focus and direction at the time. I see it as an example of a person's ability to change and take action with the appropriate motivation." Another scientist refers to learning to learn from failure as a type of maturation process. "It was a different time when I lost a day or two or three to failure. It required a sense of what might be desiccation to learn, then put it behind me and move on." Another spoke of the frequency of failure and the emotional intelligence necessary to work positively with it and embrace it. Failure was every day the norm on more difficult projects, and it was the bitter pill that made the work so challenging. The executive functions required to overlook a useless result after days of arduous work really is not easy to accept, but the best scientists drew sustenance that the next time it would surely be different. So what about emotional intelligence? We're all managers and leaders, and we understand the value that emotional intelligence brings to the workplace. Managing emotions is a huge part of emotional intelligence, and managing the emotions around failure, both at the personal and organizational level, is really no different. So Maybe scientists treat failure like a scientist because they have so much practice at it, which speaks to the advice to practice failure. Day-to-day mistakes, and think of them as learning experiences. When I asked the scientists about the difference between, well, I asked everybody the difference between failure and a mistake, this is one of the responses that I got. This is my emphasis. Failure implies owning the result with a much better opportunity to learn something. So scientists, at least this scientist, does seem to have an acceptance and learning about failure. Another model for embracing failure is that of the learning organization. So Peter Senge wrote this book, The Fifth Discipline, about learning to learn from failure and not being ashamed of it and not shaming people for it. Think about how kids learn. I have a son who's 7, and he plays a lot of Minion Rush. Is anybody familiar with this game? Okay, it's a basic running game. It's the same game as Subway Surfers, Jetpack Joyride. They're all the same game. Your little guy runs until he runs into something. So last year when my son first started playing, each game lasted approximately 2 seconds until his little minion would run into the first obstacle. But he figured it out. Now, much to my chagrin. The first time a new obstacle comes his way, again, he crashes into it and the game's over. But that's how he learns. When you stop and think about it, it's really unrealistic to think that everything we do at work will be a success. Just as it's unrealistic to think that my 7-year-old will get the Minion Rush high score the first time he plays. We learn from our mistakes. This is why it's important not to shame. If I shamed my kid when he failed at Minion Rush, he'd stop trying. He certainly would not take any risks as he dodged obstacles. Creativity Inc. talks about this program that went on in the US from 1975 to 1988. It was called the Golden Fleece Awards. Does anybody remember this? It was an award, and the winner was somebody who, it was sort of to shine light on government waste. So among the winners was a DoD research study on whether the Army should carry umbrellas. And now this to us seems quite silly. But it wasn't the only DoD-funded study that year, right? And occasionally a project doesn't work out. Shaming someone for failing seems to suggest that anyone trying something new should know the impossible, if their outcome will have value before they even begin. So I mentioned a couple of different models for getting comfortable with failure. Treating failure like a scientist, the learning organization, modeling your organization as a learning organization. And the third is thinking like an entrepreneur or a startup. So this graphic comes from Brian Matthews' white paper on libraries as startups. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It's a great read. It's very useful. So how do startups work differently? Startups have a high tolerance for risk. They have a high tolerance for failure. They ask why and what if. They put new products into production without perfecting them, and they tweak as they go. Great entrepreneurs are like Indiana Jones. They take leaps before seeing the bridge because they know if they don't, someone else will get that holy grail. That's a quote from Sophia Amoruso's book, Girl Boss, which I recommend, especially to anybody just starting out. It's a great book about entrepreneurial leadership. It's very readable. So to take a risk, you need a degree of comfort that you might fail. Wayne Gretzky said, "I skate to where I think the puck will be." I'm sure he sometimes failed because he didn't wait to be sure that the puck would be there. But his philosophy gave him a competitive advantage over those who always did wait to see where the puck would be. Pixar convenes a brain trust meeting early on in each production process so that they can see where stories are going wrong and correct them. So this is a meeting of experienced production personnel and people working on the movies. And they talk about the film very early on in the process, before it's filmed, when it's just some storyboards. And their philosophy is fail early and fail inexpensively. Peter Senge advocates something called the after-action review, which is sitting down after a project and talking about what worked and what didn't work. Outcast, a successful PR company, also known for its healthy attitude toward failure, holds weekly meetings to talk about successes and failures. Sure, no one wants to look bad in front of others, but to learn and grow and improve, we need to acknowledge failure, pick it apart, and learn from it. Talking about failures, talking about mistakes is the first step towards learning from them. It loosens fear's grip on us. We should talk about it, normalize it. To paraphrase Ralph Waldo Emerson, talk about the thing you fear, and the death of fear is certain. By talking about failure, we can change the societal perception that it's something to be ashamed of. I hope that by sharing my experiences with failure, I've helped you to understand that by shifting our relationship with failure, we can use it to our best advantage. If we allow it, failure can help us to provide new, innovative, groundbreaking services. So when I talked with my former deputy, Christina, about failure, she mentioned to me that she had made a decision to combine two positions in her area. And she said it was a mistake. It was a mistake that she'd change as soon as she had the opportunity to do so. She said you make a decision in the moment, and then the moment changes, and the decisions no longer work. I told her about this project and how I wanted to spread the word that it's okay to fail. I encouraged her, as I encourage all of you, to speak openly about your failures and what you've learned from them. Remarkable things don't happen when you take the easy route or the safe route. Accepting failure gives you the freedom to take risks. Without such freedom, you can't break through mediocrity. If you talk about your failures, you might change someone's mind. Help them to understand that failure need not be shameful. Failure is how we learn, and failure is the necessary and affordable cost of true innovation. Thank you. So we have a little time for questions if you have questions. Yes.
I just wanted to, I'm really glad you showed me Brett's good there. I think one area, like you mentioned areas like scientists, such as people, one area that in my view, you can learn so much from, because you see failure every day, is in sports. Because every day athletes fail. And not only that, but when they have a bad game, they get asked about it right after the game. That's a group of people who really have to deal with failure, because you can't pretend that nothing wrong happened. You have to acknowledge that, yeah, I had a bad game, right? It's a great place to live.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a really great point, that we do have. I think that generally there are lots of management lessons generally in sports. And I think that it is, you're right. And not only do athletes have to address the failure and kind of pick it apart in the post game, but they also have to shake it off, sometimes the next day. And I think that that's really something that we can all learn from. That's a great point. Yeah.
So when you were talking about the survey, you mentioned that people report personal failure more frequently than organizational failure. Do you think that that's because it's natural to us to say positive organizational failures as personal failures?
No, I don't think that's why, based on the responses that I got, and it was the most unscientific survey ever, so it probably means nothing. But my impression is that when I failure, people internalized that, because it wasn't that more people talked about personal failures, it was that every response was about a personal failure. Nobody went into blame mode and talked about, oh, my boss, blah-de-blah, or my organization really stinks at this part. Everything was about their own experience and things they had done. But again, it probably means nothing. Yeah.
think that there's a lot of people in our lives, might not be just work, that want to be the told you so people, which I think really impacts our fear of failure. And so, we can't change anybody but ourselves. And so like what you were saying about don't shame, and don't be that person for somebody else, because once they can see that they can trust you to not be that way, they might be more likely to not be the I told you so. Why'd you do it that way?
Yeah, that's my hope. I mean, I think we're always going to have some I told you so people in our workplaces, but my hope is, I've seen it a lot in my own professional career and with the organizations that I consult with, that, you can be the change you want to see. And if you are the person who doesn't point the finger, there's nothing to be learned by pointing the finger. Organizations don't grow by finger pointing. Organizations grow by looking at what happened and what they can build on and what they might want to change in the future. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
I think another reason a lot of librarians are scared of failure is because of the current climate with libraries. They're scared if we have an event and it fails, well, maybe our budget will get cut and we won't have money again. Or their stakeholders will look at that and they will see the library as less valuable because we put on events and 5 people came. So I feel like that's something that a lot of us internalize, that we're afraid that something we do will look badly on the library and on other libraries in general.
I think that maybe so. I think that certainly the culture of assessment really shines a lot of light on what we do. But generally, along with the culture of assessment goes this, after action review culture where you look at what you're doing and you assess it. And, what I would say to the person who is maybe afraid about doing a different sort of program and having it fail, is that there's some reason why you had the idea what might be a good idea. And to kind of look at that and build on that. And if it doesn't work out the way you thought, to really think about, well, why was that? So next time maybe it won't be a 5 people in attendance. Maybe next time it'll be more. I mean, there's lots of points where the mistakes can be made. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the innovative program is inherently flawed. There could be something else in publicity or in timing or whatever that made it be less than you had hoped for. Anybody else? I think we have time for one more question. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.